welcome to After Hours. I'm Rhonda Freeman. Many people have heard of something called the TPP, and many people like myself wonder, what is the TPP, and what does it mean to the average Canadian citizen? Well, here to explain this and to shed some light on the TPP is Harjap Grewal. He is the Pacific Regional Organizer of the Council of Canadians. Welcome to the show, Harjap.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, what is the TPP?
Well, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's a multilateral trade agreement between 12 nation states. So we refer to it as a trade agreement as a commonly used language, but it's similar to agreements such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Canadian-European Agreement that the Canadian government's right now negotiating with the European Union, which is called the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. So all of these agreements are basically framed around being trade agreements, but really it's a bit of a misnomer, and what we've been trying to highlight is that they're really agreements that sort of expand and entrench the rights of corporations.
Excuse me, okay, so
Yes.
let's go back there.
Yeah.
This is going to expand the rights of corporations.
Yes.
And is that, like, what about the governments? Do they have, like, how much say do they have still, you know, maintain in certain situations?
Yeah, so what happens is that there's multiple chapters, right? If you look at it, the trade agreements that have been passed so far, a few of the things that they do is that they just give corporations some expanded rights. So for example, they'll give corporations the right to protect certain intellectual properties in countries where they're not protected right now, which basically becomes an expense on either the taxpayer or people that are consuming pharmaceuticals or intellectual knowledge like books and those sorts of things. It just becomes more expensive. But in terms of government regulation and government control, what probably the most stark and best example of what the problem is with these agreements is this clause in all of them, which is called an investor-state dispute mechanism. And the investor-state dispute mechanisms that are basically put into these agreements allow for corporations to, if they're investing in a foreign country, a multinational corporation is allowed to use a private tribunal or private court to claim damages if a government makes a policy that's going to either hinder or take away their ability to profit.
So the governments have no control over these corporations, basically, and the citizenry is just left defenseless at the hands of whatever these corporations want to do?
I would say that not only, I mean, it's not that they don't have any control. I would say that in some ways they're actually assisting the corporations. So the government, what they're basically doing is that they're making public taxpayers' money. So we pay our taxes to the government. And they're saying that we're going to give a means to corporations to basically take money from that public, quote unquote, purse through these tribunals, right? And for things that for things that might be in the public interest. I mean, very, very good examples. A recent example is this company called Lone Pine Resources, which has a Chapter 11 investor state challenge against the Quebec government's ban on fracking on the St. Lawrence River watershed.
Right.
And so, the ban is put in place for public health concerns, for climate change concerns, all of those things. So, things that are in the public interest. And the corporation is able to basically claim $250 million in damages through this investor-state arbitration in a private tribunal, right? And what we need to remember is that $250 million could be used for all sorts of other things.
Yeah, but hold on here. I spent some time reading about the TPP, and the example that you just gave, the TPP is supposed to be chock full of environmental protection stuff. So it's actually supposed to be good for us. It's going to protect our environment, but yet the example you're citing is actually doing the opposite.
It's doing the opposite. It's actually making it harder for governments to pass regulation and policy measures that would restrict the activity, for example, of major fossil fuel like oil companies and oil and gas companies. Because if you are passing policies, those corporations are going to be able to pursue damages through these private tribunals. And that does two things, right? So on the one hand is that if a government knows that there's a possibility of being challenged in these private tribunals, it might put a chill effect on policy. So they might say to themselves, well, we don't want to have to pay up all of this money. We're just not going to pass good climate policy in order to avoid having these tribunals come forward. The flip side of that is that if they do proceed with a policy decision and the corporation wins the case, you're basically taking money that could be used for green infrastructure, that could be used for education, that could be used for the healthcare system, and you're basically giving it to corporations. And we're talking billions and billions of dollars here. Canada is already one of the most, has some of the biggest liability in terms of the number of cases that have been brought forward against Canada and the amount of money that it's already paid out to corporations under these provisions.
You basically have corporations sitting in place of government or sitting over government.
Yeah, I mean they're influencing what governments can and can't do.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's
dictating
like,
to government what they can and cannot do.
I mean, I would say that corporations sometimes try to dictate to government what they want.
Or whatever
yeah,
it is.
They lobby, they try to do that anyway. What these trade agreements do is that they give corporations the tools to you know, get compensations if governments don't do what they want. Right? Which becomes another method of trying to encourage them to do what they want to do. So, and you can see it. I mean, but the other piece there is that even within these trade agreements, it's not just what happens afterwards and the rights and everything that they get. You know, when we see how these negotiations are actually being done and who's at the table, these negotiations in terms of what our national governments are basically negotiating to give to the corporations or negotiate with other countries, these are not part of a public debate. We're not seeing what, you know, is in the text. We're not seeing any of that kind of stuff.
This is the thing I wanted to get to. Right,
yeah.
Next. There's 30 parts to this thing. It's huge. It's like a Hydra beast. I was looking at it online and it, you know, it went on, and I was reading it and I'm thinking, this is like something out of the book of Revelations. Behold, I saw a beast with 12 heads, you know.
Yeah.
And it's so complex.
Yes.
Like anything could be hidden in there. Any of those points or clauses or whatever you call them can be taken and used in so many different ways that we can't even imagine at this point.
Absolutely.
And yet right now, there's 12 countries, and they're all Pan-Pacific countries.
Pacific region,
and this is up for ratification amongst all the countries. So we've actually signed something so far.
Yeah. So the agreement has been signed, and so not to get too much into the nitty-gritty details, but just to say one thing is that it's not limited to those 12 countries. That's what's possibly one of the bigger issues with the Trans-Pacific Partnership as opposed to NAFTA and other agreements. I mean, they're all the same. They're all problematic. But what the TPP is doing is that it's actually allowing for other countries to join in on the TPP even after it's signed. And what happens there is that you basically have to agree to the state at where the text is already, and there's no further negotiations in terms of the new countries that are entering. So for example, Canada wasn't a part of the negotiations when the TPP first was being discussed. I believe Canada joined in about December 2014, and at that point Canada had to, coming in, already have agreed to everything that was already in place.
Okay, who was the first country? Who initiated? Because I'd really like to know who initiated.
Yeah, I mean, I know definitely the U.S. would have been involved.
Okay.
The United States would have been involved in initiating the process. I'm for sure not, I don't know the details of how it exactly came about. But several of the sort of bigger economies, Japan, the U.S., and others were probably involved in initiating this. But so this idea that it's also a docking agreement and that that other countries can join on, it's also a mechanism for national governments and corporations to basically have an ever-growing region. I mean, the TPP already covers about 40% of the global economy, right? It's a huge 40%. Agreement in terms of how big it is. And they can keep adding to it. And the reason why they need this mechanism of ever-expanding agreement is because they've seen that attempts to have large multilateral agreements in the past have failed because the public, communities have rallied and mobilized against these agreements to say that we don't want them. The free trade area of the Americas being one of the most prominent ones that was actually completely derailed by people's movements, and they weren't able to establish such a broad-reaching agreement. So, you know, I think what they want to do is they want to avoid public debate. They don't want the public to find out what these things are.
So they don't want, like, is there, like, I haven't seen the whole thing online. Is there any place where we can go and see the whole thing, all 5,000? I forget how many pages.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. It's like 5,600 pages.
It's accessible now, and you know, even in the process of this agreement being ratified, you know, before it was signed, you know, a few organizations like WikiLeaks and others were providing chapters, and people were learning about what's actually in the agreement. But again, I mean, you know, for the average person, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, delving into the agreement is pretty hard. What I think people need to recognize is that ultimately, whether you look at, you know, pharmaceutical patents like we were mentioning before,
which is supposed to increase the cost of
absolutely.
pharmaceuticals.
Yes, and you know, in the global south, that's a major issue because, you know, in the case of Canada, it would be a really big burden to the public healthcare system.
Absolutely.
And if you have a pharmacare policy, which a lot of people want to have a national pharmacare policy, it would basically become a subsidy to the pharmaceutical sector, because you know, the pharmaceutical sector with a monopoly on patents can basically set drug prices as they
so
like.
Big pharma is getting bigger and richer,
exactly.
And the common person, you know, especially somebody who might not have, you know, benefits, they're looking at a medicine that they used to be able to purchase
absolutely
easily, now is out of reach. Like,
absolutely.
I mean, it's heinous.
And one of the big deal, like one of the really important and problematic pieces of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that they're looking at a lot of countries in the global south that will be joining the agreement. A lot of those countries that might not have full coverage for healthcare and all of these things have been relying on generic drugs that have been produced in countries like India as a means to deal with, like, you know, like terminally ill conditions like HIV, cancers, other things.
Right.
Once this agreement is passed, it entrenches the right of the pharmaceutical corporations to prevent generics from entering all of those markets.
So there will be no generic drugs that are affordable to people.
And especially in those countries where, you know, like not only, you know, some of the conditions are, you know, very serious and a lot of people are facing them, but the people's affordability of these very expensive pharmaceutical drugs is going to be a life and death situation, right? They're going to be making decisions about what they can pay for.
But here they say it promotes economic growth, enhances innovation, productivity, and competitiveness, and raises living standards. Like, that's.
I mean, and we were talking about this.
That's what it says.
And we were talking about this earlier. I mean, you know, we only need to look at NAFTA now. I mean, when NAFTA was being negotiated, and there was actually a public debate about NAFTA, unlike the TPP, this was the exact same rhetoric, right? That everybody was going to be making more money. It's going to be great for the economy. People's living standards are going to increase. We look at NAFTA now years later, the living standards, you know, I mean, there's the Rust Belt of the United States where clearly living standards did not increase.
No, they diminished.
There's the peasant movement, you know, the peasant living in Mexico where so many people were displaced by land basically being privatized, taken out of commonly held control, and resulted in people living in poverty, looking for other places to work, you know, migrating to places like the US and Canada. And even in Canada, we can look at the average wage of a worker in Canada hasn't really increased by the degree that the economy has grown. But, and so I think what people need to recognize is that sometimes when people are talking about these agreements, they're worried about this kind of national protection, right? They're like, oh, you know, Canada is going to be under threat, or the U.S. is going to be under threat, or Mexico, or, you know, in this case, Japan or Vietnam. And the real issue we need to identify here is that this is not an issue of one country becoming a victim versus another. The real issue is that this is about corporations of all of these countries extending and exercising power over the public.
Far beyond what they already have.
Far beyond what they already have. And already they have a lot,
and
as we know.
literally holding a knife to the throats of governments saying, you know, we rule.
I mean, again, increasing tools, right? They're increasing the tools that are available to them. And if we go back to, you know, like you mentioned, the climate change issue there, right? So we come out of the Paris Agreement where there's these commitments that were being made to to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount, have a real commitment to meeting those targets. And at the same time, you're passing an agreement that actually doesn't even have the words climate change mentioned within the agreement. There is no mention of climate change, and there isn't really a commitment to responding to climate change. And so we really need to recognize the fact that this agreement doesn't really do anything for the environment.
What I wanted to say was I had read something or heard something that it affected local farmers, and BC farmers, and there was a lot of concern. How exactly is that happening?
I mean, all sorts of ways. I mean, there's probably several ways that actually has an impact. I mean, big agribusiness is always a threat. Increasing, if you make policies as a government to support domestic and local farming, it would have an impact on how a corporation is then able to say that this policy isn't impacting our ability to profit, right? And there's this sort of like equal access clause as well, right? So, a lot of, governments, especially municipal governments and otherwise, have for a long time talked about this need for localizing the economy, right? So saying buying local, we've all heard about the 100-mile diet, all of these kinds of things, which are both good for local economies, but also good for the environment.
And the mom and pop businesses.
Mom and pop businesses, all of those kinds of things. But what these agreements basically allow multinational corporations to do is to say that you can't favor local purchasing.
Really?
Yes. I mean, and that's because that's basically that equal access and equal market access that is being given to corporations, right? Is that it's saying that you can't have national policies to protect yourself in certain sectors, right? Or they're trying to open up certain sectors for more investment. So all of these things are things that are negotiated. It's different. You have to look at the details of each sector.
But that's just one tiny, I mean, the whole agreement is huge.
Exactly.
It's
Absolutely.
30 parts. I mean, how does this affect, do we even, or does anybody know at this point, if any of this contradicts NAFTA or how it jives with NAFTA? It
doesn't contradict NAFTA. If anything, it's like, I mean, the joke, or sometimes people say this, is that it's kind of like NAFTA on steroids. It's only increasing the power that corporations had under NAFTA, under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So for example, intellectual property, those kinds of patents or copyright rules that were under NAFTA, they're only being extended. The ability of corporations to use the investor state clause, there's just going to be more of them. We were talking about 3 countries with the Mexico, US, and Canada. Now we're going to have 12 countries, far more corporations that can access this. And so, what we're really looking at is that we're seeing that NAFTA was sort of step 1. The World Trade Organization has wanted to have this kind of policy or these kinds of rules in place for the entire world, right? But
it's like a whole global.
Yeah, and so they try to set these trade rules for the entire planet, and they want to have some of these tools available to corporations everywhere. And what we're seeing is that in this case, they're trying to do a little bit bigger than NAFTA, right? So. The Canadian government, after realizing, and the Canadian and the US and other governments, after realizing NAFTA, post-NAFTA, that some of these big multilateral agreements weren't going to be possible, what they started doing was they started negotiating bilateral agreements, right? So there's a lot of these bilateral agreements that the Canadian government has already signed. I think about maybe 27 or so are already in place.
Okay, so the average everyday person, they're going to see their prescriptions skyrocket. Prices.
Yeah.
Many of the local mom and pop businesses are going to suffer.
Yeah.
Are governments going to, I mean, basically, it's almost like this is meant to take the place of, it's like a one government for every country. Literally a one world government.
I mean, it's not necessarily a one world government, I would say. I'd say that it's that like the corporate sector is just going to gain more power, right? And we also need to recognize this isn't something new, right?
It's been coming for a long time.
And it's always been the case. I mean, this is what people have always tried to do. I mean, I often talk about the fact that when the British East India Company entered and colonized South Asia, their mandate was free trade. And so what they were trying to do was they were trying to basically set in place the best laws, the laws and practices and a form of government that best serve the needs of corporations, right? Following a lot of independence movements and the anti-colonial movements that happen around the world, corporations, these multinational corporations like from the UK and the United States and everywhere else, wanted to assure that some of those gains and some of those rules that were put in place for them, that they could continue exercising and exploiting resources around the world, whether it be in Canada or in Vietnam or or elsewhere.
Right.
And so what they did was that's when the World Trade Organization was established, right? And so ever since the anti-colonial movements had removed formal colonial rule of Western governments in the global South, they've been trying to create these tools to make sure that they can still exercise corporate power in these areas.
These agreements seem to become far more reaching, far more complex, in that the common person really has almost no idea everything that's in them.
Yes.
And it reminds me of the story of how do you cook a frog? You put it in a pot of cold water and you very slowly turn up the heat and eventually he's cooked.
Yes.
By the time you realize that, oh, hey, we're in trouble.
Yes.
This maybe was not such a good idea. Your goose is cooked.
Absolutely.
Your frog is cooked.
Absolutely. And so for example, in North America, specifically within Mexico, the U.S. and Canada, we're already under these rules, right? And as I was saying, there's already all of these bilateral agreements that are already putting. So these rules have slowly been already put in place. So the TPP is only going to make things worse, but some of those rules are already in place for these corporations to exercise.
And also, I had read something that they think, or I guess a group of European exporters believes that the TPP is a deadly threat to European exporters. I don't know exactly how that would be, but I'm assuming because we'll be trading so closely with these Pan-Pacific countries.
I mean, but at the same time, the European Union's negotiating agreements with Canada and the U.S. as well, right? So I think that's just a level of competition. I think they're trying to compete for markets, right? Like all of these corporations. And again, when the European Union says we, what they're referring to is their corporations. They're not referring to the average person. But
yeah, I don't know if that was the EU that had said that, but someone had made the statement that they saw it as a destruction of world trade. But in actuality, this is...
it's not so much about trade. I mean,
right.
and as you mentioned off the top, right? So like you look at, there's about 30 chapters in the U.S.
How much of it is about trade?
How much of it is about, I think about six chapters of the TPP.
And then the rest is just rights for corporations.
Yes, absolutely. So, and just to also recognize that, in a lot of these countries, you look at Vietnam, you look at, Japan, you look at the U.S., it's not as if we don't have goods from all of these countries in Canada right now. There is already trade.
Right.
So this idea that we're opening up
that
trade...
we need to do this is misleading.
It's
because
very
we
misleading.
already have this.
Absolutely. So,
it's just another way of bringing in more controls for the corporations and another avenue for them to exploit each country as they so want to.
Yeah, and basically, so what we've been really trying to emphasize in a lot of the public education work that we've been doing is that the media, the mainstream media, that the discussion that's out there, and a lot of what the corporations and governments are going to say is that this is about trade and market access, and what we're trying to highlight is the aspects of the agreement that is about
it's much more
corporate power, right?
Corporate power,
and that's what we really want to emphasize.
And then secrecy. There was I read an entire article on the secrecy that surrounds this TPP. Why the secrecy? For me, when I hear, okay, that they've been keeping this under wraps or they've not been upfront about everything, that tends to make me think that there's things in there that they really want to slide under the radar and not have everybody be aware of.
Absolutely.
So that can't be good.
Yeah. That's exactly why they're doing this, right? I think they've seen that any major, I mean, you look at in Europe right now, when you, and in places like New Zealand, that's a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, wherever these free trade agreements are being proposed, in a lot of countries, including in the US, there's a lot of public opposition because they realize how they're going to be impacted by these agreements. So the best way for governments and corporations that are partnering with them to pass these agreements is to keep them as quiet as possible. So the secrecy is, on one hand, you don't want the public to know, and on the other hand is that it also it makes passing these agreements a lot easier. So for example, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that simply right now, member countries that have signed the agreement, when they're going to ratify it, they can't negotiate anymore in terms of what's in the agreement. Right. All they can do is they can say yes or no to the agreement that's in place, that's been signed, right? So they've basically gone through years and years of negotiations in secret to set the terms of what we're saying yes or no to, right? And again, what we need to realize is that who had the access to these negotiations and to the text as it was being developed? It wasn't the public. No. It was corporate lawyers that represented corporations.
Yeah, when I looked it up, I saw a list of legal firms and an institute for economics, I think.
Yeah. So you know, a few government officials, but literally a lot of the influence in terms of the chapters and the text and the framing of these agreements is being done by corporate lawyers and lawyers that represent corporations.
So we've just got a couple of minutes left. So right now, I had read something that said, you know, the Prime Minister is very interested on getting input from the general public. So I guess right now is a time when it's very important for the public to let their thoughts be heard. And their opinion on this thing and whether or not they're for it or against it.
Absolutely.
And then that's where your organization comes in.
I mean, so yeah, we've been hosting public education events all across the country. We've been doing a lot of public education online and just raising awareness of the agreement to begin with. One of the things that is available to people to influence the government and try to put pressure on the government to not sign this agreement is that they've opened up a public comment period where they're accepting submissions from the public, whether individual or organizations or, you know, associations that represent people in whatever way they might. You know, it could be faith-based groups, it could be trade unions, it could be your school, whatever it might be, and to submit to the government about how this agreement might impact them. So the deadline for that is October 31st. You can find information about—
How fitting, Halloween.
Halloween. It's a very scary agreement, so I mean, that is very fitting.
Very appropriate day.
So it would be, you know, I would ask anyone that's viewing this to encourage organizations to really make submissions.
So they should contact the Council of Canadians?
Yes.
And they can do that by going to the website?
Yes, so it's just very simple.
www.canadians.org. www.canadians.org. Well, thank you for coming down and discussing this with us. And wow, it sure gives a person a lot to think about.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And there's more information on the website too.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.